Spring break is over, so what better to do after the long holiday than to head to Miami? That's what spring break means, isn't it? You go to Miami. Anyway, Formula One spring break was a bit different. The engineers weren't all on holiday. In fact, they've never been working so hard. In fact, the Miami Grand Prix features more upgrades than I've ever seen before, and this episode of Tech Talk is going to try to get through every single one, even though the production team are telling me that I don't have time to do it. I'm just going to ignore them and keep going for as long as they let me, and probably a bit longer as well. So, coming up, we've got some really wild and weird exhaust pipes, we've got some flipping bizarre wings, and finally we've got some crazy floor changes. In fact, we've got so many bits to talk about, I think I should just get on with it. And in fact, every team on the grid has got an upgrade or two on the car that you can see, and the only team that doesn't is Aston Martin, but they've got some upgrades that you can't see, and hopefully they work to reduce the vibration, though in free practice it didn't seem to be working too well for them, did it? But moving on from Aston Martin, let's talk about a team that we haven't really talked about that much in terms of upgrades in Tech Talk so far this year, McLaren. And the reason is McLaren didn't really bring any upgrades until Miami, where there's a significant package on the car. But before we get into what McLaren has turned up in Florida with, let's just explain why they haven't got so many upgrades to talk about from this year so far, well, at least until now. That's because they won the Constructors' Championship, and the team who win the Constructors' Championship get the smallest amount of wind tunnel and CFD time. So McLaren took a conscious decision at the start of the season to build a baseline car that was quite adaptable, and then to look what everybody else had come up with before copying their homework, so to speak, while developing some of their own ideas as well. And that's exactly what we see with some of the new parts the team has introduced. They've revised their front suspension elements. That's fairly standard upgrade practice. And then there's been a change to what I think we have to start calling the barge boards on the side of the car, though I'm still not really sure what we need to call them, because they're not barge boards in the traditional sense. And as you can see, it's got a remote vertical forward section on this design, and the trailing edge of the larger section is quite significantly sculpted on the rear, particularly when you draw on it badly like I've done. Better to see it without the telestration, actually. Then have a look at these lower elements as well. I think these are just beautiful pieces of engineering, almost look like a bit of artwork. In fact, I've got a painting at home that has a shape that's quite similar to that. So that's all quite a nice bit of design, but when you change a bit like this, you have to change everything that's downstream of it. But take a look at some of the details that aren't so obvious, because the longer you look at a racing car, the more you start to see. Have a look here. The supporting element that comes out to this bargeboard section is a twin element design. Now remember that, because another team has got a slightly more advanced version, or slightly different version, of this concept, but the McLaren has split into two separate elements, and again, trying to use something that's a support as an aerodynamic aid, well, it's completely within the regulations, but quite nice to see. A subtle change that McLaren made to the car that was made a lot less subtle during free practice, you can see here, and I don't really need to telestrate it actually, because, well, McLaren have done it for us by throwing green goo all over the leading edge of the car. And what they're really looking at is the new mirror support housing along the leading edge of the side pod, and that's why they've splattered the flow visualization die all over it to see how it actually interacts with the rest of the car. And the big change is actually just ahead of the cockpit. That section that links it to the main body is slightly more curved than it used to be. It was squared off with a little extension on the inner edge. But what's really caught my attention with McLaren is their very different approach to cooling. Now, when you look at the side of the car, you'll notice there's barely any cooling outlets, and most teams will have gills or slots or slits or slats along the rear bodywork. There's very little to see on the McLaren. The only addition that I've noticed is on the centre line of the car, and they've got these centre line cooling outlets. You can just about see a heat exchanger in the centre of these little louvres on the centre line of the car. I think Haas was the first team to explore with these centre line outlets many years ago now, and McLaren just having a very small cooler position, and that probably means they've relocated a cooler under the bodywork for these hotter than expected conditions in Miami, 50 degrees plus centigrade track temperature in practice. But when you get to the rear of the car, it's a cavern. It's not just a cooling outlet, it's huge. All of that hot underbody air is being exhausted out through this just ginormous cooling aperture. It's the biggest I've seen for a long time. But you hear what I said about exhausted? That wasn't a mistake. Have a look here. McLaren has introduced a very subtle, very small blocking element at the rear of the exhaust tailpipe, and underneath it, just about visible in this image, you can see that there's a little winglet underneath the tailpipe exit. Now, this is something we're going to see a lot of in Tech Talk today, and a lot of the teams had seen what Ferrari did in previous races and have essentially copied that idea, but a lot of people thought that nobody could, other than Haas, could copy it because Ferrari's differential placing opened up an area of technical freedom, and that was indeed true. However, what McLaren and some other teams we're going to take a look at have essentially done in some of the wording of how they describe these parts as it's a support bracket. It's not an aerodynamic element, it's a support bracket. Interesting interpretation if you ask me. But let's move on from McLaren to another team with a huge amount of... They're telling me to hurry up, I'm not going to. Let's move on from McLaren to another team with some big upgrades, and quite significant ones. Red Bull Racing, they haven't really been at the front this year so far, but I think this car is still developing, and there's an awful lot more to come from it. And as we move rearwards on the car, you'll start to see that Red Bull has been in the kitchen cooking up something special. Not quite as spicy as Ferrari's Arrabbiata, but we'll come back to that. So the biggest change I want to draw your attention to is just here. It's the brake inlet scoop, if you like. And that's part of the cooling setup on the front of the Red Bull. And they've revised it for Miami, possibly because of the high temperatures. But I actually think it's a bit more of a substantial upgrade for the car. Now, the scoops are all around the front end of the Red Bull. To understand what it's doing, Red Bull absolutely covered the cake tin in flow visualization dye. And that's actually quite unusual to see a team actually coating the internal components with flow visualization dye. Though the reason it's probably quite unusual to see is that the components are internal. They probably do it all the time. In fact, I know they do. But we got to see it in the pits in Miami during free practice to see that, because Red Bull wanted to understand, and this is why I think it's not just a circuit-specific upgrade, Red Bull wanted to understand the flow through the brake system rather than just through and around the outside of it when it's all bolted together. One of the reasons that Red Bull wanted to look at this in such detail is that they've actually upgraded their brake cooling package. I always find this really weird. It looks like the leading edge of the cooling section of the brake duct is blanked off. I mean, it is blanked off, but there feels like there should be a cooling duct here, but there isn't, because all of the cooling airflow comes in on the gap between the tyre and that inner plate inside the front wheel. And they're not the only team to be doing this, but when you look at the brake ducting from the rear, Red Bull's massively enlarged the cooling outlet, so it's clear they're getting a bit more mass flow between the tyre and that plate on the inside. And of course, with a bigger cooling outlet, it's going to have a bigger knock-on effect on all of these lovely bits downstream. So they need to study that, and that's why they filled that brake cake tin with flow visualization dye. And one element they're going to be taking a close look at is just here, in the wake of all of that mess coming out of the front brakes. Have a look here. Now, we looked at the one on the McLaren. Have a look here at the version of that supporting structure on the Red Bull with this additional second element linked by those 3 extra sections, then 2 separate pickup points on the inner section of the chassis. You can take a closer look at it here, because I love these link sections, and look how this has been just bonded in. This metal section has been bonded onto that composite structure. Now remember, this structure isn't officially an aerodynamic component, it is a supporting structure, but there is freedom for the teams to muck about with its design, and they clearly are doing that for aerodynamic gain. And I love that sort of stuff that the teams are trying to find their way around. And this is just the same part in context. You can see what I think, again, I'm going to have to call a barge board. It's not really. But the growing complexity of these parts on all of the different cars, clearly trying to generate a bit of load from it, as well as using it as a flow conditioning device for everything downstream of it. Red Bull is just working in the same way every other team is, and you can see that separate section there. In fact, it almost looks like the flaps as a plane comes into land, doesn't it? If you're looking out the window as a plane comes into the runway, you see that section dropping down. It looks very much like that. Aerodynamics is aerodynamics, air is air, so that is how the teams are playing it. Whether it actually does that, wind tunnel, CFD, you know the story. Red Bull's side pod, though, is something of great interest to me. Now, you can see a couple of little interesting details here as we move rearward. You can just about make out on the side pod, you can see clearly the upper side impact structure, that bulge, where the bodyworks come in so tightly, the side impact structure is a little bit exposed. Lower down, you can just about make out the bulge for the rear side impact structure as well. And a lot of teams will actually have it lower down, and you can see a bulge in the floor. But Red Bull, you can just see it where it's really been sucked in, almost shrink wrapping that leading edge of the side pod. But now I'm going to take you down memory lane. Think of Aston Martin in 2023 with that really radical canyoned or gullied bodywork that took inspiration, I think, from the 2022 Ferrari, but had those really deep sculpted side pods. Alpine had a very similar approach as well. Now look at the side pod of the Red Bull. Now from this angle, yeah, kind of a side pod, right? Well, let's change the angle we look at it from head on and above, and you can see that the outer part of the Red Bull side pod is really just this bulging section that sits on the outer section, and then there's this big, huge gully all the way down to the rear of the car where they've actually enlarged the so-called rodent hole at the rear of the floor there. Now if you look at the old Aston Martin design, hopefully our production team, who are definitely got nothing to do while we're recording this, will find the Aston Martin shot with the bulge that housed the Mercedes power unit and the exhaust manifold. Actually, if you look here, it almost goes inwards, so tight and so small and neat must that Ford branded Red Bull power unit be at the rear of the car. Then on top of that, I mean, there's so much going on with this car. Have a look at the rear floor detail. This is pure artistry, the shapes of it. And then this new element ahead of the rear tyre, which is almost keeping some of that airflow in and guiding everything into the so-called rodent hole, mouse hole. Love it. It's a lovely, lovely bit of car and engineering design. Take a different view of it from slightly closer up and you can see that rear floor section, the trailing edge of the side pod, and this much enlarged section ahead of the, well, on the inner face of the rear wheel. And look at these elements all on the inside. Ooh, wonderful. Now, Red Bull's rear end design treatment is very, very interesting, but Red Bull, well, like McLaren, they're not averse to copying other people's homework, it's fair to say, because have a look at their exhaust. They too have got a plate on the back of their exhaust pipe, or sorry, a bracket, a supporting bracket, I think we have to call it. And if you look closely here, particularly on this section on the inner part of it, you can see that that plate isn't actually a separate component, it's fully part of the exhaust structure itself. Now, a few people have asked me, looking at the linkage, does that move? No, it doesn't, it's rigidly attached. And that is the shape of Red Bull's exhaust tailpipe. So I don't think Red Bull are classifying this as a bracket, it's just part of the exhaust tail design. But these plates in the exhaust tailpipe, why don't teams just change the shape of their exhaust pipes? And that is something I think we're going to have to try to study as the season goes on, because teams are clearly finding a benefit to doing this, because to my eye, this is going to cause a significant back pressure in the exhaust system, and that's going to cost the power unit or the V6 engine power. So why would you want to do this? And they are also working in conjunction with some small aerodynamic elements either side of the side impact structure. Of course, no one's really talking about Red Bull's exhaust, are they? They're talking about this, the Red Bull rear wing. Well, it's a rear wing, isn't it? I mean, what's so exciting about it? It's not like it goes upside down or anything, is it? Yep. They've done that as well. So Red Bull have taken inspiration, or separately come up with their own version of what some people call the Macarena wing, what I like to call the rotisserie wing, or a wing that goes upside down. And once it's fully open, the slot gap, or the gap between the lower edge of the wing and the wing when it's fully open, is utterly enormous. And it's very different and more extreme perhaps than the Ferrari design, as Red Bull probably trying to generate a bit of lift from those inverted elements. Well, they're not the only team that's been playing with rear wings. Let's move on to the originator of this concept, or the first team we saw using it, Ferrari. And no, I'm not hurrying up. I'm getting on with it. There's so much to cover. The more you ask me to go quicker, the slower I'm going to have to go, because I'm going to have to do more and more. All right? So be done with it. There's so much to talk about. It's not like you're going to switch the lights off on me. I'm just going to keep going until I'm finished, because there's so much to talk about. Ferrari is what we're talking about, and Ferrari have introduced some new front wing end plates, which have quite an interesting design. They've introduced a vertical section on the foot plate of the front wing end plate, and also revised just the front wing end plate shape in general. And as you can see here, a bit more curvaceous, and you've got the exposed tyre sensor at the trailing edge. Not too much to get excited about, but don't forget, Ferrari have been playing around up here as well. This is an element on the halo that they had in clear plastic originally. They've quietly reintroduced onto the car. Now, I know there were some questions from other teams about how this fitted into the rules. Does it count as part of the windscreen? Well, Ferrari put it on as part of the halo fairing by the look of it, but we'll come back to that in a moment, because here's another look at that front wing end plate, and you can see the new shape of the upper section. looks quite different from this angle, doesn't it? And you can see the vertical element or vertical sticking, vertical bit, I can't remember what you call this, on the front wing end plate. And that's an interesting little bit of development from Ferrari. As we work rearward through the car, Ferrari have also revised their brake cooling duct layout. Hot track, not a great surprise. Also trying to find a few gains with that. And then we come round to the side of the car. Do you notice anything new? Because I do. Well, not new, but hidden maybe slightly better. Ferrari have reintroduced the halo winglets on the tip of that front driver protection structure, I guess is the best way to describe it. And now it's not manufactured in clear polymer. It's a solid black part of the halo surround. Now, previously it was introduced in clear polymer to help so it didn't obstruct the driver's vision. Now though, it's not. So be interesting to see if they keep that on all the way through the weekend or if others might raise some questions about that. But certainly a fascinating little bit of development by Ferrari. They've also revised their rear floor. I'm being really hurried up by the production crew behind there, so I will talk about the front of the floor because this is a lovely piece of engineering which somehow makes me think of Azerbaijan, but not quite sure why. Have a look here at these vertical elements on the leading edge of what we must call the barge board. And just lovely triple element design here, and they're just really playing around quite nicely with this piece of design. You can see it from a different angle here, and how it also interacts with the trailing edge of the elements on the inside of the front brake ducts. You can see this little section here that sticks out from the trailing edge, and then it's got this little just tab, I guess you have to call it, on the inner face of it, and a little element here which I'd like us to take a closer look at, but we haven't quite got the opportunity yet, because if you get that close to the car, Ferrari might have a few little words in our ear saying, hang on guys, that's a bit too much. And let's move on though to the thing that everybody's talking about, the rotating rear wing. Now, we've seen this before, except you haven't. This rotating rear wing is not the same as the rotating rear wing we saw previously in testing and then trialled a few times but never actually raced or qualified. As far as I understand it, Ferrari are planning to race and qualify this variant of the wing, and they have quite significantly revised the layout of the wing. Let's have a look at the end plate. The end plate is far more squared off on the leading edge than it was previously. They've reshaped the wing supports as well. Those are slightly revised in shape. The wing elements themselves are different. And then on top of that, the mechanism has been slightly adjusted on how it's installed in the wing itself. But you noticing what I'm noticing? Because if you're a Stanley Kubrick movie fan, you might have noticed this in the middle of the wing. It looks like something like from 2001: A Space Odyssey from this angle. A big old vertical element in the middle of the wing that sticks up. It's a sticky uppy bit, but just not like you've known it before. And when we look at it from another angle or close up, you can start to see that this is, I thought at first it was like a packaging part, or maybe it was a stay for when the wing is fully rotated, but it's not. It is an aerodynamic development. I'm not quite sure what it achieves, but we'll come to another wing that has something in the same area. And I think the teams have found a very small, thin area of technical freedom on the centre line of the wing. And when I say thin, this is that device from another angle. It's tiny. It's extremely thin. No, I won't speed up. It's extremely thin. And well, does it work? Don't know. But Ferrari seem to like it. And the rear of the Ferrari is also featuring some nice little details as well on the end plate. I mentioned it has changed on the end plate. They've introduced a couple of these little sculpted elements on the end plate, and those are, yeah, fairly normal. We've seen them for a few years. Ferrari haven't used them so much. Now they are. But I think the thing we're not really talking about enough on the rear of the Ferrari, you can just about see it sticking out in the corner of this image of the diffuser, which I've just brought up because I like showing pictures of diffusers, is this. They've massively revised the exhaust tailpipe winglet section, introducing a new outer element. You can see it covered in those temperature monitoring strips as Ferrari try to understand at what point it gets too hot and it's going to fall apart. That's what those stickers do. And then it's just incredible how little of the exhaust pipe is actually exposed, because you've got to think about, if you follow that shape round, almost half of it is completely blocked off. And again, a lot of people are saying that's going to create a lot of back pressure, and I think it is. Now, we've seen from various videos that it is making the exhaust plume go almost vertically upwards, which is what the team are trying to achieve. The wider aerodynamic impact of that? Well, a lot of teams are speculating out and clearly trying their own variants, but Ferrari clearly developing lots of little solutions. Then have a look here. Quite subtle to see, but I'm hoping you can see it here. You can just see an array of additional little winglets, almost teeth-like, along the sides of the rear impact structure. That's something nobody else has tried yet, and it's really subtle, but what gorgeous engineering. Now, you won't see that on the footage of the car out on track because you have to be incredibly close to the car to even notice that. In fact, I only just noticed it just before we started recording this, so it's a really subtle detail. Now, if we look at the rear impact structure from another angle, you can't even see those elements because they're hidden beneath the extensions to that rear winglet, and you can see it's almost got an end plate and everything. And you can't see the lower end element so clearly, but you can see clearly that Ferrari trying to generate a little bit of load with that, but also just really pushing the regulations to the absolute limit and really letting their engineers exploit the technology they have at their Maranello headquarters. But it's not just Ferrari playing, is it? Because this is Miami, there's a huge amount of stuff, and a team that's got, well, American ownership to an extent is Williams. Now, Williams is a car that we know is about 28 kilograms overweight, and I hear rumours that the team are planning to introduce a B-spec car, which is lighter, much later in the year, around Monza. I know, we're running out of time, I'm still going. But they've also played around with their exhaust bracketry, I think we have to call it. Now you can see the exhaust tailpipe here quite clearly. It almost looks to me like the tailpipe has a slightly trumpet section to it. I don't know if it looks like that to you. Is it just a perspective thing? Certainly to me it looks like the exhaust flares out like the sound generating Mercedes exhaust pipe that was trialled a few years ago. Didn't really work. But you can see here it isn't, it's just the shape of the exhaust tailpipe. But in the middle you have this bracket, and it is a bracket in the team's documentation, that to me looks like a winglet, which I think is a way of trying to achieve the same effect that the other teams are using a plate for. But the Williams version looks more like a winglet with a very sort of U shape, and I think a wing section on the inside. So trying to achieve that same effect. Okay, I'll go to the next car. They're really rushing me here. Alpine. Now, I did want to talk about Alpine because you may remember at a recent race we saw Alpine introduce a new winglet on what I still want to call the DRS pod, but it's the active aerodynamics pod, and you have an upswept section at the rear with a little winglet section in the middle. Well, coming into Miami, Alpine have introduced a new variant of this, and the plates around it seem to extend a lot further rearwards, and it seems to have a slightly different shape to what we've seen it previously. We also get to see the mechanism underneath, which doesn't look entirely finished, does it? It looks a bit like an experimental part, so whether we're going to get to see that in use in the competitive sessions, we'll have to wait and see. Or will Alpine come up with their own version of a flippy, roundy, upside-downy wing? I don't know. So looking at the rear of the Alpine, I noticed something quite significant, because this is something that wasn't really obvious when you first looked at the car. Remember that McLaren cooling outlet I was talking about, how huge it was? Look how tiny Alpine's is, because they're using some of these side pod outlet louvres as well. But in the exhaust tailpipe, they too have a twin element plate in there, trying to achieve that same effect that Ferrari have introduced and started to exploit, and all of the others are trying to do, claiming that they're exhaust support brackets. And they're not the only team with a twin element exhaust plate as well. Mercedes, for example, have a twin element section on their tailpipe, and I think that's another area to exploit. And some people are saying Mercedes don't have an upgrade package on their car. They absolutely do. There's loads of really interesting stuff on the car to take a look. Hang on, guys, I haven't finished yet. There's still quite a lot of cars to get through. Guys, hello? There's someone turn the lights on. I've got cars to talk about. Is anyone still here?